It's great to be here and also to follow that really fascinating program this morning. I'm going to begin with something that may seem a little bit counterintuitive by sharing with you two of my favorite quotes, both of which are lines that, when you hear them, might seem to contradict the ethos of historic preservation, but which I think actually get to the very essence of it. The first is from the Italian writer Giuseppe Tomasi de Lampedusa from his novel The Leopard, in which he writes, "If we want things to stay as they are, then they will have to change." The second is another expression of the same idea, and it's from another writer, the English writer G.K. Chesterton, who said, "All conservatism is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them as they are. But you do not. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon enough be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must always be painting it again. That is, you must always be having a revolution. Briefly, if you want the old white post, you must have a new white post." Now, both of these quotes explore a paradox, that nothing truly stays the same, because time never stands still. And if we love something and want to keep it looking and feeling the same, we cannot do that by leaving it alone. We have to intervene constantly, engaging with it, changing it, updating it, fixing it, rethinking it, reevaluating it, renovating it, caring for it. That, of course, is what you do in Palm Beach. However much people may think the Preservation Foundation is trying to stop the pace of change, what you are really doing is managing change to keep the character of the city and to make it continue to work in a world that will change whether or not we want it to, a world that will inevitably be different. But the reality of change is more than just a cliche about time not standing still. It's really a call to think about the meaning of preservation, which I believe can't be a force against change. If you think of change as only what happens in that evil world outside, and of the act of preservation as making Palm Beach a fortress, a bastion of things as they always have been, well, I think that effort would be destined to fail, because it denies the wisdom of those lines with which I began, the wisdom of recognizing that change is inevitable and that we cannot live in denial of it, and that sometimes, paradoxically, we can best preserve the essential nature of a place by allowing it to change. What preservationists need to do, and what I think you have often been doing very successfully here in Palm Beach, is to manage change, to guide it, direct it, and to assure that it incorporates the best of what has come before. And then when we change something, we do it for the better and for the benefit of the entire community. When I talk about change, accepting change, then, the last thing in the world I'm meaning to say is that, well, things happen, stuff happens, too bad, live with it. Absolutely not. Laissez-faire is not the message of those quotations with which I began. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's that you have to intervene in the same way that Chesterton talked about painting that white post over again, knowing that if you do nothing, you will no longer have what you thought you had, because it will change anyway. But maybe even that is a bit misleading, because what I mean is something more than just taking care of what's here. Something more than just painting the white post again and again to keep it fresh. Palm Beach is a lot more than a white post, not only because it's a more complicated entity than a picket fence. More to the point, it's not a museum. Time does not freeze for any city or town, unless it's maybe Colonial Williamsburg or Disneyland. And I don't think either of those places, whatever their virtues might be, are the best model for Palm Beach, which, while it might indeed have certain elements of Fantasyland to it, is nevertheless and must continue to be a real place. A city is not a museum, as I said, and real places are subject to the forces of the world, forces of growth and change, economic and social and cultural change. Even here, a place that seems in many ways to be as removed from the realities of the world as any, we cannot freeze time. You know, I heard a very simple but wonderfully poetic phrase recently, the ever-continuing past. And that says it perfectly, since that phrase, ever-continuing, suggests a past that is not only visible, but living, a past that has an ongoing life that in some meaningful way connects to the present. We don't preserve to go back into the past or to try to stop the movement of time. Any effort to try to do that is going to be doomed. We preserve to try to make a better present, to use the past to enrich the present, to learn from it, not to escape from it. So in a place with an ever-continuing past, the past is not something sealed off to look at. It's a place in which the past helps define the present, and in that sense continues to live and continues to evolve. Its meaning changes as each age uses it differently, views it differently, interprets it differently. To be that kind of place, a place with an ever-continuing past, is the goal here, as in all living communities. The point again is that while Palm Beach might contain some museums, it should not itself be a museum. Now, to say that we want to view the town of Palm Beach as a living entity, subject to change and growth as all living entities are and have to be, is not to say that we cannot control what happens to it. We very much can, or you very much can, and must. As surely everybody on this island knows, a garden too is an organic living thing. But if you don't manage it and control it, it will quickly become an overgrown disaster. We expect to intervene in our landscape because we know we have no choice. And we need to do it to keep the landscape healthier and more sustainable, as well as more satisfying to us than it would be if we let natural growth run amok. Well, much the same could be said of the town itself. Now, actually, I kind of like that analogy, in part because it makes me want to pause for a moment and think of how many people are involved in the enormous industry of tending to the landscapes of Palm Beach. And to think that if only 1/10 of that number were taking care of Palm Beach's architecture and its zoning and its planning, managing the metaphorical garden of the city, that is, as opposed to caring for the literal garden of the trees and plants, well, it would make a big difference. The metaphorical garden is really the public realm of the city. The literal garden is everyone's private property, and one of the greatest challenges in the United States right now is that we often take better care of our private gardens than we do of the public garden that is the city itself. Now, I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, since the Palm Beach Preservation Foundation has been operating along these lines for a long time now and has no illusions that preservation is only a matter of saving a few historic buildings while the rest of the town does whatever it pleases. At least since Robert Grace's time, Palm Beach has been a place that has understood the value of the townscape as a totality, the value of looking at the public realm. You know that the form a new building project might take can have as much impact on the future of the city and the sense people have of what their city is than the question of whether or not a single historic building is preserved. I think preservation in Palm Beach is really about the preservation of an idea that is more important than any single building. Because that idea is a belief that in a town, in a city, the whole is always more than the sum of the parts. It's something that is true everywhere, but especially so when the town happens to be a beautiful place on beautiful land beside the Atlantic Ocean and has one of the greatest assemblages of magnificent historical architecture anywhere in the country. It all connects, the streets and the buildings and the old ones and the new ones and the public realm and the private realm. And it needs to be seen in a holistic way. Everything in the town is intertwined and interdependent. Now, to say everything is connected, by the way, is not the same as saying everything new, everything needs to look the same, or that everything new needs to look like something old. We can get back to that idea in a minute, because it's another aspect of historic preservation that's often misunderstood, the mistaken belief that you show your love for the old only by imitating it. Actually, maybe let me get into that for a moment just right now to make it clear. I am second to none in my love of Addison Meisner and Maurice Faccio and Marion Sims Wyeth, and also of finely made historicist architecture in our own time. And I have no patience with the tired old argument about the architectural zeitgeist, the idea that there's one appropriate style for every era and that we shouldn't do Spanish Mediterranean architecture because we're not in that era. Well, as I think everyone here knows, we weren't in that era in the 1920s either. There was nothing authentic about the design that Meisner came up with in 1918 for the building that became the Everglades Club, which soon enough became a template for Palm Beach on a wider scale. Meisner's architecture was not the style of its time. It was a made-up pastiche of elements from past styles with a sprinkling of Italianate details along with the Spanish that Meisner introduced to Palm Beach because he thought, correctly, that the architecture that had been built in the first wave of the town's development was mainly a bunch of things transplanted from the north, and that this new town needed something different that connected more naturally with the sun and the ocean landscape. It was an entirely artificial insertion of Spanish and Italian architectural details, but it worked brilliantly. It worked less because of what he was doing than because of how well he did it, how magnificently Meisner expanded it to the Via Meisner across the street and then to house after house, creating a kind of urbanism, a way of making a kind of template for a larger whole that other architects could follow. And follow they did. And it became the style of Palm Beach. Now, there's nothing wrong with continuing to do that now, as plenty of people are doing, and many of them are even doing it extremely well. But neither is there anything wrong with also doing some other things, so long as they're designed with an acknowledgement that they are part of a larger whole, and that they make meaningful gestures toward the street and the city of which they're a part. For many people, some architects as well, there seems to be a kind of safety in embracing an older style. And while, as I said, I will never join with those who say it's wrong, I also don't feel it's the only way to do it. And the problem can be that as we produce more and more architecture in a single style, that historical style runs the risk of becoming all we see, or almost all we see, and a certain kind of life is lost. A place begins to feel just a little too perfect, a little too managed, a little too far from the real. Sometimes it can even begin to take on more than a bit of the air of a theme park, albeit a very grand and elegant version of one. The 1929 Comprehensive Plan for Palm Beach cites the word charm to discuss the essence of the town, and while that is certainly not wrong, it's not an easy thing to define. I guess you could say of charm, as the Supreme Court famously said about pornography, that you know it when you see it. But the problem, of course, is that one person's charm may be another person's preciousness. And perfection can in itself be, well, sometimes a little too perfect. And I will even go so far as to make the radical assertion that perfection if it comes without variety and surprise, can sometimes be a little bit boring and even rather twee. And we know that while charm is usually well-meaning, there can sometimes be something a little soft, a little sentimental about it. Things begin to feel like they're shaped entirely by a single fantasy. Now, it's true, of course, that Palm Beach, unlike most other towns, was created entirely to be a resort. It's not like Newport, that grew out of an old colonial village, or Southampton and East Hampton, which were farming and fishing communities before they became resorts, or Nantucket, that was a whaling community. But even Palm Beach is really more than a resort. It's a place, and this was discussed so well this morning, in which many people live real lives all the time. And when places are shaped only by sentiment and nostalgia, which are among the least profound emotions there are, they might be fun to visit, but they're not places to live real life in. So yes, it is fine to continue to do Spanish Mediterranean architecture, especially when it's done as well as so much that's happened here. But I hope not only Spanish Mediterranean architecture. I think it was actually good for Palm Beach that there was a period of pushback against Spanish-style architecture over the years, and architects like John Volk, for example, did so many other things, including this amazing house that I regret having never had a chance to see. Palm Beach does have a smattering of modern architecture, including that wonderful apartment building by Edward Durrell Stone, and I think a little more of it will not cause this place to fall apart. It is not as fragile as a hothouse orchid. We don't necessarily strengthen the preservation movement by insisting that everything new be made to look old. It's indeed one way to honor the past, but not the only way. Now, since I seem to be into quotes today, I'm going to offer you one more that I love, which to me sums up so much of what makes a great city work, which is the observation Lewis Mumford made that in a city, time becomes visible. Those 6 words, in a city, time becomes visible, tell us everything. And time does not only mean the past, it also means the present, and the visibility of the present and the past in dialogue with each other. I want to say a couple of other quick things more specifically about some of the challenges facing Palm Beach right now. But let me say one more thing first about what, to me, makes this town so distinctive. You may think that I'm a little crazy when I say that what I value most about Palm Beach is not the breakers, not even any single house, not even Addison Meisner. It's the fact that you can walk in this town. You not only can walk, you actually want to, or at least I want to when I'm here. I mean, Palm Beach has a real core. And while I know that nobody would mistake Worth Avenue for the typical American Main Street, or Royal Palm Way for the typical boulevard, nevertheless, it's wonderful to walk here. And it's wonderful to ride a bike here. It's wonderful to go along the lake trail and so many other parts of this city. The fabric of a real town, a real city, is here at a scale that is appealing and comfortable. There's a density that makes it feel like something more than a suburban beach community, but neither is it a place of enormous buildings that change the scale, as so much of the Florida coast is. And the one enormous building that Palm Beach does have, not that one, but the breakers, is an anchor for the whole place. It is a reminder that sometimes the best things are the exceptions, the things that break the rules. The lucky thing is how somehow you have managed to have one of them, which is better than a dozen of them, and better than none of them. Palm Beach would be diminished if the breakers did not exist, but it would be diminished even more if there were hotels like it up and down the entire coast. If that had been the way Palm Beach developed, it would have looked maybe something like Atlantic City in its heyday. Not the horrible Atlantic City of the casino age, but the genteel Atlantic City of 100 years ago. But if you study that city, it was really only a facade along the beachfront, a row of high buildings behind which there was not much of anything at all. Palm Beach, though, is a real place, and a place that consists not just of hotel guests, but of people interested in and committed to this community. It's a place in which people live, not simply go to for vacations. Now, that last sentence taken out of context could seem a little bit silly, since we know that while Palm Beach is indeed a place in which people live, it is not exactly a place in which the widest and most diverse range of people live, and it could not exist without all kinds of satellite places off the island that exist to support it. In this sense, Palm Beach has less in common with its near neighbors in Florida than it does with places elsewhere like Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Southampton, East Hampton, Aspen, Montecito, and so forth. Places that have become so desirable that they are no longer diverse communities. In all these communities, families who've lived there for generations and built and shaped the community often find that they, and certainly their children, can no longer afford to live there. And as we know, many of the people who are in there living in places like this cannot afford to live in them. The problems of prosperity are real, even if they're not as urgent as the problems of poverty in our society. And they certainly affect the long-term future of places like the communities I mentioned. Now, Palm Beach is much luckier than, say, Nantucket or Aspen, because other options for housing are not a 2-hour ferry ride away or a long drive over a mountain pass. But my point here is that prosperity, wonderful as it is not a plus in every way. It adds all kinds of pressures to a place, most of all the pressure for growth and the pressure for motorcycles. Sometimes the best friend preservation can have is poverty, strange as that sounds, because a place that has no resources is unlikely to destroy its buildings, whereas a place that everyone wants to be in will be under enormous pressure to make itself bigger. Now, I'm well aware that as Palm Beach debates its future, poverty is not the issue that's number one on the agenda. But figuring out how to deal with the enormous pressure of being one of the most in-demand places in the entire world is the problem. And figuring out how you continue to grow as all living communities must, while not allowing growth to destroy the very things that make this town so attractive. I don't underestimate the scope of this challenge, in part because even if you're successful at resisting this pressure, that success brings new problems in its wake, because the more you limit growth, the more precious, the rarer, the more expensive a place becomes, which of course is exactly what has happened in Palm Beach in the last few years, as well as in all the other places I mentioned. Every one of those towns is a place in which many people have trouble staying and raising families, even if they have roots there. I don't have an easy answer to this, but I do know that a place that does not have a range of types of people and a range of incomes is a place that loses people who have roots in it and want to remain in it is diminished as a community. For this reason, by the way, I don't mind entirely the significant growth that's been happening in West Palm Beach. Although I admit that since I don't live here, I don't have to brave the traffic that it's caused, which is only getting worse. I'm not commenting on the architecture of West Palm Beach, but only to say that the development, all this development has at least allowed growth to take place in this immediate region without creating violent change and disruption to the physical form of Palm Beach Island itself. You could say that West Palm Beach is the pressure valve that helps preserve Palm Beach. And if you look at it that way, which in a sense is like looking at Palm Beach and West Palm Beach as a kind of collective ecosystem, then perhaps the West Palm Beach situation is not so bad. We could say the same about the development to the south, beyond Sloane's Curve. Much of it is not very impressive architecturally. I'm being diplomatic there. But how grateful we should all be that it was not north of the Bath and Tennis Club instead. This entire place would be different if that had happened. So the southern stretch was, in a sense, the first pressure valve. Now, West Palm Beach is the second. In any case, my point is that Palm Beach is really more connected to its surroundings than its physical form as an island would suggest. It couldn't really exist on its own. We all know that. It needs the airport. It needs hundreds of businesses in West Palm Beach. It needs the housing West Palm Beach provides. Palm Beach and West Palm Beach are separated by Lake Worth and by separate governments, but they each profit from the other and they each need the other. This is a region. If the different aspects of Palm Beach all connect to each other, so does Palm Beach connect to the region of which it's a part. Now, I know we're here to talk about Palm Beach and not West Palm Beach, or regions or big urban planning questions, and it's reasonable to ask, what does all that have to do with preservation? What I've been trying to say is that effective, meaningful, historic preservation is a matter of understanding the essence of a community and using a respect for the past to strengthen it, which is more than just making sure that an old house or historic church is not torn down. Those are worthy things, and I'm all for them, but preservation in Palm Beach means more than that. It needs to be about the life of the community and about keeping those things that make this place unusual and special. The fact that much of Palm Beach is a walking community. The fact that it has beautiful architecture of many styles. The fact that it does not have many extremely large buildings. The fact that it's a place in which architecture and nature coexist in an unusually comfortable way. I know that one of the things the Preservation Foundation has been concerned about lately is the Wells Fargo site. And while I haven't studied those plans carefully, I think it's a good example of what I'm talking about, a project that impacts on the future of the town and tells us a lot about how both the citizens of Palm Beach and the development community view the town. At the outset, it's worth saying that keeping an ugly surface parking lot is not something that helps Palm Beach very much at all. And it's far better to see the space filled with a piece of architecture, especially if it's sympathetic architecture. I don't believe, as I've said, but I'll say one more time, that the health of a community is assured by trying to ban all new development. But I do have an issue, as I know the Preservation Foundation does, with the idea of saving only the first few feet of the buildings along South County Road, some of which are facades by Palm Beach's finest architects. Collectively, they make a magnificent streetscape that plays a significant role in the urban quality of Palm Beach that I've been talking so admiringly of. Slicing off the back and putting something much bigger behind that facade is disingenuous at best and destructive at worst. It's certainly not preservation by any means. The facades that are now there on South County Road are all different, and they fit together well, a good reminder that an urban whole is complex and not usually of one architect's or one client's making. It has variety and a certain amount of accident. Nobody planned every inch of it, and that gives it more life. And this brings up my other issue with this project, which is that it is one huge complex, designed all of a piece and built all of a piece. The charm of Palm Beach, to use that word again, comes in large part from the fact that it was built in pieces, bit by different people who shared certain values and ideas, but often had different ways of achieving them. The architect Louis Kahn once said in his amazing and poetic way, "The street is a room by agreement." And we can see that's exactly what happened on South County Road over the years when those buildings went up. It wasn't a massive development. It was a group of different things that were constructed by architects who had different ideas, but agreed to play well together, we might say. That's very different from the manufactured charm of a huge real estate development that's designed to evoke the feeling of what's there now, but misses the spirit in a certain way. In large part because it's all a vast complex pretending to be disparate pieces so it doesn't look like an airline terminal, but is really just as much of a single entity. Still, on the plus side, this project would increase the amount of downtown residential use, which is good for the town, better surely than a huge commercial structure. And could, if it's altered somewhat from the present plans, have more restaurants and shops, which are also good. My guess is that if there is a way to make this development somewhat smaller and hold on to larger chunks of the original buildings than is now proposed, and maybe broken up a little more so it feels more like it was the product of multiple architects, well, if all those things can happen, then it might, in the end, be a positive project. What this matter does show us, though, beyond any question, is that preservation in a community like Palm Beach is not just a matter of saving certain individual works of historic architecture. That will always be part of the mission. But it's clear that that alone is not enough, partly because there are many situations in which the issue is not just saving a building, but adapting it to a new use that often involves significant change, and preservationists need to understand how much change is acceptable and how much is not. It's certainly the issue that's faced with the Paramount Theater, for example, to take another current issue. There are no formulas for that, lest you think it is easy. Every building is different, both in terms of what it represents and how easily adaptable it is. And every proposal is different, both in terms of what it adds and what it takes away from the value of the original architecture. We do not need to treat all of our historic buildings like hothouse orchids, delicate and fragile and not to be touched. Many of them are strong enough architecturally to withstand being pushed and pulled a little bit. And buildings can sometimes gain wonderful new life and enrich the ongoing life of a community by evolving in a positive way. But they can also be destroyed by insensitive change or ruined by it. And the challenge is in knowing what change is positive and what change is destructive. Palm Beach was created as a resort, and it will never be like other places exactly, nor should it be. But it is also a living community, and living communities change, or they are no longer living. Every generation, wherever it is, has the right, maybe even the obligation, of reinventing the world, and of making its mark. But every generation also has the obligation to see what is best about the world that it is inherited and to protect it. And these things are often in conflict, which is why the greatest challenge is to do both of these things at the same time. To accept change that makes a community better and keeps it alive, and zealously protect it at the same time. That takes knowledge and discipline and patience and love, all in the cause of keeping a cherished place the same. Knowing that we must accept change sometimes so that things can stay the same. Thank you.